Sergio Perez has been one of the most affected drivers during the Dutch GP, and it seems like the majority of that comes from his team's decision to pit Verstappen and pull the undercut move on the Mexican driver. While this didn't sit well with the veteran, it's safe to say that all of his mistakes he made throughout the race have only strengthened Red Bull's argument as to why Perez shouldn't be trusted with the lead of the race. But nonetheless, he wasn't happy with how he was treated and has demanded immediate actions from Red Bull on this matter. The Zandvoort GP had a very interesting and anticipated start, with every driver out there on the soft tyre while the rain started to pour down in lap 1. The teams had to make a quick decision as to whether or not they'll pit for an intermediate tyre or remain with the soft tyres, hoping that it'll just be a light drizzle, and gain positions on the backs of those who decided not to risk it. Perez belonged in the group of drivers that didn't want to risk anything, and from P7 he quickly emerged as the race leader with more than 11 seconds of lead over Verstappen once the Dutchman changed to intermediate tyres as well. This would have been the dream scenario for Perez had it been Baku or Jeddah, having 11 seconds of advantage over your teammate in the early stages of the race. But for some reason, not only was he not able to maintain that lead, but the catching up from the Dutchman was just out of this world. In just 3 laps, Verstappen cut down 7 seconds from Perez's lead, 4 of which came in 1 lap. This made the difference between both of them around 3.5 seconds, and just when the weather started to stabilise and Perez managed to keep the advantage for a couple of laps, Verstappen was called for the soft tyre change. This was a move that would have definitely not happened had the roles been reversed, and if we're being asked, it was a diplomatic move by Red Bull to give the lead to Verstappen due to the fact that there was a dry line on which he would have been able to absolutely drive a 3.5 second faster lap compared to Perez's intermediate tyre lap. Nonetheless, Perez entered the pits 1 lap after Verstappen and was quite shocked when he was undercut, asking his team why this call was made when he was the race leader. Christian Horner tried to elaborate on it in his well-known diplomatic way, as he went on to say, "The way that Verstappen cut through traffic was quite sensational. Checo had the target to pull the gap on the cars behind him, but Max's pace as he came through the field was such that at one point he took 7 seconds out of him over 3 laps and was coming very fast." Then you get to that awkward point at the crossover, and Alonso and Gasly behind him had pulled the trigger to switch to slicks. You could see from Albon that the circuit was coming alive for the slicks, so had we pitted Checo first, they would have both undercut Max, so it would have gone from a net 1-2 to a net 1-4. So we pitted Max first with the risk that he'd undercut Checo, but would end up as a team first and a second. It was a no-brainer. Was the decision to undercut Perez a no-brainer for Red Bull? I highly doubt it, mostly because the general excuse is that the team was afraid that Gasly and Alonso would have undercut Verstappen. Keep in mind that we're talking about a guy who is winning races with 30 seconds of advantage and is afraid of an undercut from Aston Martin and Alpine. I would have accepted the threat from Aston Martin since, in the early stages of the race, more precisely at the second restart, Alonso did try to make a move on the RB19, and they do resemble some of the pace that the Austrian team has, but being afraid of Gasly just doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, it seems like Red Bull doesn't have enough trust in Perez to give him the opportunity to lead a race and bring home the win, and quite honestly, the veteran did that to himself. He had a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane, clipped the wall while entering the pit lane, spun out in turn 1 in the wet conditions, and almost ended up as Joe and Sargent. You can talk whatever you want about Verstappen's character, but the man is acting like a robot, and there isn't a single mistake from his side, no matter the conditions or the circumstances that are happening on the track. It's quite possible that Red Bull wanted to avoid a very unpleasant situation on the track, a fight between both of the drivers, mainly because it wouldn't have been an easy one. Zandvoort, although a speedy circuit, is a very narrow one, and accidents can happen very fast if you don't pay attention or try to be a bit more aggressive. While there was no doubt that Verstappen would have got Perez up until the end of the race, considering that he was flying over the grid and passing drivers like he was in one of his sim races, this was the way of showing Perez where his place is and where it will be in 2024, the wingman. And even with a 5-second penalty and 7 laps remaining, Perez was not able to get past Alonso and build that difference compared to Gasly, who was following him closely. If you compare this outcome with the fact that Verstappen shed 4 seconds in 1 lap, then it's more than clear to us as to why Perez is where he is and why the team is no longer trusting him to do the hard work for them and bring the win home. Even in situations where he's the race leader and has an advantage over Verstappen in terms of entering the pit lane first. The Mexican has called for action from Red Bull right away, and even though he wasn't that mad and was aware of the circumstances on the track, there's no doubt that he'll have a lot to say as to why he was not the preferred driver over the tactic that Red Bull chose for Zandvoort. Speaking about this, Perez went on to say, "I think in that scenario the team has more information than we do at the time, so it's something we would obviously review during the meeting. I'm sure there's a reason behind it. We were expecting rain. The team was telling me that there was more rain coming, so it was very important to, because the track was on the dry side, so if I was to push I would have just destroyed completely the intermediate tyre." Even Helmut Marko bashed Perez race weekend, saying that his qualifying strategy was quite weird, and during the race, it was pure luck that saved him and enabled him to finish the race in the first place. However, the difference between him and Max is very vivid now, and it's obvious that this hasn't happened during the 2014 to 2020 Mercedes-dominated era, where not only did we have other drivers winning the race, but the gap between Bottas and Hamilton has never been 4 seconds per lap. Toto Wolff raised some questions as to what's going on in Red Bull, as he feels like the team is heavily prioritising Verstappen and has already put Perez in a second plan, which could translate to bad news for the Mexican, because we now have Alonso back on the podium and Mercedes are still not giving up on the season. When talking about this, the Austrian went on to say, "Odd, bizarre, Checo is not an idiot. We have seen it all these years. Checo is a Grand Prix winner, a multiple GP winner, and he was at Racing Point. I cannot comprehend. We have seen Max destroy every single teammate that was with him, whether it's the ability to create a car around himself that is just very tricky to control but fast if you can, that makes those gaps. But 1.3 seconds? I haven't heard any explanations, but odd." And it is strange that Verstappen can absolutely annihilate his competition with a 30 seconds advantage over the second place driver, and that second place driver is rarely Perez. Therefore, I think that while Perez does have a legitimate right to ask for a review of the decision made against him and favouring his teammate, who has turned into his nemesis in the past 2 years, his driving needs to change sooner rather than later, or he'll be without a racing seat in the foreseeable future. With this in mind, Perez will have a very difficult period ahead of him, and now that we are nearing the season's last races, there are some venues that Perez would prefer much more than Verstappen, such as Singapore and Brazil. But with how the Dutchman has broken every record there is and has levelled the 9-win streak of Vettel, I highly doubt that Perez's words will have any weight against one of the most dominated drivers that the sport has seen. Do you think Red Bull's strategy was the right one, or do you think that Perez was damaged by his own team yet again? Let us know in the comments below.